Hi everyone, I hope you're all well. I am here today to talk to you about HSP108 this week. And the first part of the topic that we're going to talk about is victims of crime. So this week we're looking at the combination between victims and policing. But in this first little lecture, very small one, I thought I would talk about the different issues related to victims, what victims are, how victimisation is identified and defined, and all of those types of things. Because it helps us to understand then how policing interacts with that. Okie dokie. So, what is victimology? This is sort of a little bit of background stuff for you. So victimology is the scientific study of victimisation and looks at the experiences of being a victim, particularly of different types of crime. And they do this in different ways. They look at the relationships between victims and offenders. So, for instance, if a person is involved in domestic violence, then what's the relationship between those intimate partners? Or if there's family violence, what's the relationship again? The interactions between the victims and the criminal justice system, and looking at the different parts of the criminal justice system, such as the police, courts, corrections, all of those types of things. So the relationships, the interactions, and of course, looking at the relationship between victims, their lifestyles, and the victimisation that's involved. So, for instance, if we look at LGBTI folks, which is something that I'll touch on a little bit in the second lecture, one of the things that everyone seems to focus on is whether or not people are wearing rainbow clothing, if they've got if they're a male and they're wearing makeup and things like that in public places, then, oh, well, you've kind of brought it on yourself type of thing. That'll make more sense when I talk through in the second lecture. So the relationship between the victims, their lifestyles, and the form of victimisation can be really useful to have a look at. And, of course, it's particularly concerned about the victimisation of vulnerable groups of people and all of these different vulnerabilities and the way that they intersect. Because often someone will perhaps be of a non-English speaking background, but also be from, they might be a refugee. They might also be from a very low socioeconomic background and not have a lot of access to financial resources. So all of these types of things are what we call victimology, looking at these things and looking at these relationships between victims and crime and so forth. It's also an approach that we use to look at human rights violations that are not necessarily crimes. So these are things that we often sort of say, well, it doesn't quite fit with what we're talking about. And it really depends on the jurisdiction as to how this works. So, for instance, in Australia, if someone walks past to you and says, oh, you're a horrible person, you're a Muslim, go back to your country or something like that, right? That's what we call a hate incident in the UK, which is using hateful language and so forth. Whereas in Australia, we don't have any legislation that defines that as a hate incident, so it's not recorded. So that could happen all over Australia every day and it's not actually recorded. Whereas in the UK, because they have this thing called a hate incident that they do record, then they can, it's not so much considered a crime, but it's somewhere in between. So you've got a space over here where no one records it. You've got a space here in between where we do record it because it's significant. And they've got a space over here where it's actually a crime, which involves physical abuse and emotional, financial abuse, all of that sort of stuff. So this stuff in between, often it might not be considered a crime, but it's still quite significant. For instance, this person might come in and say, well, I've had this person scream profanities at me and tell me to go back to my country. There might be 12 or 15 other people who've also had that same experience in that same street from a very similar looking person. That would mean that it's a repeat offender and that they may be able to pull all of that information together in order to go and apprehend the person. And of course stop particular types of crime from happening. So this is how we think about victims and the links between victims and human rights and so forth, and the manners in which we record different types of things in order to be able to best support victims in those processes. Okay, so who is a victim? For us, we're going to go with the UN Declaration of Basic Principles of Justice for Victims of Crime and Abuse of Power. And this is a fairly well-known definition in this area. So a victim is someone who is individually or collectively has suffered harm, including physical or mental injury, emotional suffering, economic loss, or substantial impairment of their fundamental rights. Okay? And this has happened through acts or omissions that are in violation of criminal laws operative within member states, including those laws prescribing criminal abuse of power. Now, this is really interesting, the way that they say acts or omissions, because it's not necessarily just an action that someone perpetrates against somebody else that can make somebody a victim. It can also be what is not done that can make someone a victim. So police inaction often leads to the victimization of people or to the deaths of people, depending on the circumstances, just as, ambulance inaction could also lead to the same circumstances. So one of the things, a good example of this is a very recent case that's gone through the courts in Australia around Miss Du, D-H-U. If you put that into, forgive me, but I've completely forgotten her first name, an Aboriginal young woman, I think she was 22 from memory, and she was put into a holding cell. Little did they know she had 2 or 3 broken ribs because she was part of a domestically violent partnership, and her partner had beaten her the day before, and those broken ribs had gone septic. So she was extremely unwell. She was pulled up for being under the influence, if I remember correctly. I can't remember what of. And when they put her in the holding cell, her condition deteriorated quite rapidly, but not without letting people know. So she was well known to be a drug user as well, and she was very loudly asking for help, yelling for help a lot of the time, saying that she was in a lot of pain. Clearly on the CCTV camera, you could see that she was, she urgently needed medical attention. Took her to the hospital. Even the medical practitioners were in the wrong here. They said that, she was just basically said that she's a whinger, and that they didn't medically examine her properly and see what was actually going on inside her body. So they sent her back to the watch house, left her there overnight. She continued to ask for medical help, and of course in the morning, I believe, they took her to the hospital again when they found her unconscious, and it was too late and she passed away. So she has become a victim of inaction in the criminal justice process. So it's pretty important. So those omissions of actions, where the actions actually haven't happened, those support processes are not in place, that are in place, have been ignored and pushed to the side for some reason. That's also how we can get victims in criminal justice processes. So of course, very typically when we look at processes of victimisation, it's traditionally measured by reports of crime. We have this thing called a dark figure of crime, where it's like a triangle and it goes down to the bottom. Down here in this little triangle spot is what we do know about crime. And they're the ones that are reported. But all of this stuff up here, that stuff is not reported. Commonly sexual assaults and things like that, but also things where people think, well, it sucks, but they're probably never going to catch the offender, so I won't bother going to police. So trust is also another big issue in relation to that. So the dark figure of crime will never be able to really access, because that's it's an area of concern where we still haven't figured out how to get people to report that crime. But trust is also an issue, and I'll talk about that more in the second lecture that I talk about. Policing. The victim of the crime varies depending on the type of crime, and that could be someone who, that incident that I was talking about before, where someone walks past somebody else and tells them to go back to their country and then tries to pull their headscarf off. So that's a very, very common experience for Muslim women in particular. Now, a very resilient Muslim women might not report that. They think, well, it's no biggie, it's just, my normal everyday experience, which is really disturbing in and of itself, but that is true. Some women do think that way, whereas others think, well, that was awful, I really need to let people know that that was happening, and they'll go and report it. So it depends on the type of crime and also the type of person that you are. Having said that, there are two ways that we think about victimisation. There's primary victimisation, where the harm is immediately connected with the criminal event. So that could be like the bag snatching image that we saw on the slide before. It could be being a victim of a drunk driver in a car. It could be being a victim of gunshot, whatever. There's so many different ways, but you get what I'm trying to say there. But in addition to that, there's this thing called secondary victimisation, which we'll talk about again in the second lecture, where it's post-crime harm that comes from that circumstance that develop over time. So, for instance, you might have been in the Lindt Cafe, for example, when the siege happened, terrified out of your wits for such a huge amount of time, very, very likely to develop post-traumatic stress disorder post that particular moment in time. So this is what we call secondary victimisation, where a whole bunch of other issues are developed as a result of the primary victimisation that's happened to that person. Of course, there's the additional harm that happens as a result of the criminal processing systems, where it kind of talked about what we, in the case of Miss Do that we were chatting about before, but also things like not giving them access to the capacity to upskill so that they can be reintegrated into the community, the capacity for them to be sexually assaulted in a correctional environment, being denied, food and water and things like that, which is quite a common experience depending on the police officers when people are in the watch house. All of those things can have an impact on a person as well and be a form of secondary victimisation. I once spoke to a young person who was held in the custody cells, watch house of a police station for 5 hours not because he was drunk or anything like that, if I remember correctly. He did say he had been drinking, but the police pulled him up for just a random name and details check, and he told them his name, and his name was the same as a very famous celebrity. I don't know what that name was, he never disclosed it to me, but he said the police didn't believe him. So said, oh, you're lying to us, why don't you just tell us your real name, blah, 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 blah. Anyway, as a punishment, they arrested him, took him down to the watch house, put him into the cells for 5 hours. He was there before they finally checked with somebody else and found out that, in fact, his name was as he said it was. So wasted 5 hours of his time, and I can pretty well assure you that young person is never going to want to have contact with police again, regardless of how much they might be victimised. So those types of victimisation also link to this secondary victimisation stuff. The ripple effect across communities. So if a person dies for whatever reason, that ripples out across their friends and family, obviously. If a person is involved in a very severe traffic accident, of course that impacts their friends and family, depending on what the circumstances are. So all of those things have a ripple effect. And of course, society as a whole might be thought about as a victim of crime, where, there's lots of discussions around this with terrorist incidences and so forth. But I think you get the point that I'm making there. So the consequences of victimisation are huge, and I could never even imagine to cover this off in one tiny little lecture like this. In fact, I'd need an entire unit dedicated to the consequences of victimisation. Emotional distress is extremely common and seems to be a recurring theme for all victims of crime. So one of the most common problems that we see that comes out of about 3/4 of different types of victims are very much psychological based problems. So fear, anxiety, self-blame, shame, and difficulty sleeping is another one. These are very common outcomes of different types of crimes. Now, one of the things that they talk about, for instance, is it's not necessarily they can't sleep because they're having a whole bunch of nightmares, but it could be that they're just at this elevated level of anxiety and that they physically can't get themselves to wind down and so forth. That can lead to all sorts of chronic issues such as PTSD and so forth. Post-crime distress is also linked to other sort of pre-existing emotional problems, as well as demographic variables and so forth. So if they're from a lower socioeconomic background, they might be left in a circumstance where they physically don't have the resources to survive because of this victimization. Someone's taken all of their money. They've been scammed by an online defrauder or whatever it might be. And of course, victims may experience a whole bunch of different psychological reactions, increase in the belief of personal vulnerability, the perception of the world as being meaningless, the view of themselves overall in a negative light, that they just genuinely feel like there's no point living anymore, that they're useless or hopeless. A very, very common response to sexual assault and rape is just totally freezing and not being able to respond in the process of that. And of course, then the victim goes on to blame themselves for pretty much their entire life about the fact that they didn't respond and do anything, and they feel completely powerless and helpless in that circumstance. So you can see the consequences of victimization are pretty broad. Now we have a whole bunch of victims' rights that I wanted to quickly touch on. They deserve and have a right to be involved in the criminal justice system, as well as participating in different levels of the criminal justice process. And this is particularly around sentencing and parole often. So not so much focused on policing, but it just gives you a bit of background. They might be providing evidence rather than emotional blackmail to those processes. Their fears and misgivings about offenders can be redirected to the processes of sentencing and parole, so it feels kind of restorative in a little way. Victims need to be to acknowledge explicitly their responsibilities. The victim's rights do not automatically mean the loss of offender rights. This is pretty important. So we can't outweigh the offender's rights in conjunction with the victim's rights. We need to be thinking about that equally, regardless of what the offence was. And this is one of the most difficult things that people think, that people have to work around when they're working in probation and parole, for instance. And of course, the state is obliged to safeguard citizens. So all of these different things are things that help to support victims' rights in these processes. And of course, the front line in victims' rights is obviously their right to safety in their own homes and in their local neighbourhoods, and etc. And we'll look at an example this week, Fiona Pilkington, that clearly breaches those rights in obvious ways. So just a little bit about the needs of victims very briefly. We need really explicit, clear support processes such as counselling, funding of refuges, provision of information to victims. All of those types of things really help to ensure that that person is being supported after the crime happens and that they're not, going to jump off a bridge or something, which is a very common outcome for a lot of people. We also need access to compensation, and that can be in any form, really. It just depends on what the circumstances are and how those processes happen. But it gives victims some sort of financial recompense for the harm suffered, and that may be involved in some sort of determination through conferencing or restorative justice, whatever it might be. Prosecution processes, of course, are another way where we can support the needs of victims, centred on the court case itself and the offender, where the victim impact statements are used to actually help to assign a penalty depending on what the sentence is going to be. And of course, restorative justice processes or conflict resolution processes, where there's a process where they organise all of the people to be in the room, including the offender and the victim. They have support people there. They have police that were involved, and they all sit down together and they chat about how they're going to move forward. The person who experienced the crime, the victim, gives their statement. The offender gives their statement about why they did it. Then there's typically an apology and so forth and all of those types of things. And a lot of people find these processes incredibly effective, even dealing with difficult things like sexual assault and murder. It's been profoundly useful. In other ways, not so useful as well, but nonetheless, a very victim supportive process. Okay. Of course, we have a whole bunch of different programs and procedures in place to support victims. When something's happening in the police investigation, we need to notify them. Prosecution, sentencing, parole decisions, all need to be notified back to the victim. The victim impact statements give them a chance to have their say. The court orientation helps to familiarise victims about court processes. They can get transport to court proceedings, providing an escort in court so they feel safe. A compensation that I've already touched on, mediation, which I've already touched on as well as family conferencing, and police cautioning. So police cautioning might just be, for instance, a young person's family representative, the police officer, and then somebody else. And they just sit down and they walk that young person through a caution. And then, of course, there's things like the flexibility now with Skyping into or video recording video evidence for court so that they don't have to be in the presence of the offender at that particular point in time. Anyway, I'll stop yabbering on now because we've reached about 22 minutes. That just gives you a little bit about background about victims of crime. I hope that's useful, and I'll chat to you soon in the next lecture. See ya!